Hello and welcome back. In this section we're going to start to look at charting and graphing of financial information, and in particular stock and share prices. We're going to start by getting some data to actually work on, and I'm going to show you how to get that from one of the most straightforward sources that you'll find on the internet. Now we're looking at one of the pages on the website of the Financial Times based in London, probably the best known source of financial information in the world. We're not actually going to use the FT site. Part of it is only accessible by subscription, and in fact in some ways the FT site can be quite a complicated one to find your way around. There are one or two little interesting things here just to point out. For instance here, sector performance here. This little graph in the middle here is an interesting one, and we're going to be looking at this later on in the course when we look at things called sparklines. And these are a fairly recent innovation, and they're cropping up all over the place, particularly on this sort of financial site. The site we're going to use for our data to actually demonstrate the various stock and share price charting options is actually Yahoo. Now, if you access Yahoo and click on the link to finance, you'll get a page something like this. Now, in fact, depending on where you are, you may have a local Yahoo page. This is actually Yahoo for UK and Ireland. The URL is uk.finance.yahoo.com. I'm going to use what's probably the most widely used one of all, which is really the core Yahoo Finance page, which is basically the US one. And I'm going to go to that page, so it's finance.yahoo.com, and that takes me straight into Yahoo Finance. Now, on this particular occasion, all I want to do is get some prices to show you how the various charts and graphs work and how to build them. So I don't really mind what the prices are for. In the base page here, there is a box here where I can enter a ticker code. If I start to type, I put in the letter A. Everything beginning with A starts there. Let's put in B. I'm now looking at the ABs. Let's try Alliance Bernstein Holding LP, which is an equity, as I can see on the right there, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE. Click there. And I have now information about Alliance Bernstein Holdings. Now, there's good summary information down the page. The thing I'm particularly interested in is over here on the left. It's historical prices. Now, I'm going to look at those historical prices in just a moment. But first of all, when we've done this charting, make a point yourself of coming back and looking at some of the charting that's available on Yahoo. I think it's fair to say that when Excel started offering charting and graphing facilities specific to finance markets quite a few years ago now, the charts that were produced were deemed to be pretty authoritative and good quality and useful charts. Now that so much information is available on the internet, in many ways some of the graphing and charting you get on websites such as Yahoo somewhat overshadows the charting and graphing facilities in Excel. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the graphing and charting facilities we're going to look at, because they're still perfectly adequate and they can do a good job. But what's been done on the internet in some ways is soaring forward, as with most things on the internet. So when we've actually produced some of these charts, come back and have a look at these yourself. There's even interactive charts where you can actually tune the chart to your exact requirements as you go along. But here we're interested in historical prices, so that's where we're going to go next. So what we're interested in are the historical prices. When we get to that page, we can see we have a table of prices. On each row of the table there is a day, and on the day we have an opening price, high price, low price, closing price, and volume traded. On the right we have adjusted close, which is basically the closing price adjusted for dividends and splits. And on some in some cases, such as this date on May the 11th, we have a dividend payment. Now just above the chart we have the date range covered by this list of historical prices, and we can set it to any date range that we want. I'm going to change those dates in just a moment. We also have a choice here of showing prices daily, weekly, monthly, and we can also show only dividend payments. At the bottom of the table we have confirmation that currency is in US dollars, and we also have these buttons that let us take us through successive pages. Now for this particular equity we've got prices going back to 1988, so you can imagine on a daily basis there are going to be quite a few of these pages. Now we're not going to work with over 20 years worth of data to begin with here anyway. We're going to take a smaller sample and just start to work on these graphs and charts on a smaller sample. But if you wanted to work your way through, you've got a next button, obviously takes you to the next page in the table, and then you've got first, previous, next, last. I'm sure you've used that sort of facility before. We're much more interested though in this one, which is download to spreadsheet, where we can actually basically take any selected amount of this data and download it to a spreadsheet. That's what we're going to do, but first of all let's go and choose our data. And I'm going to get daily prices, and I'm going to download to a spreadsheet. Now when I click to download to spreadsheet, it actually gives me the option of either opening the spreadsheet file or saving it. Now I could save it. It will be saved as a CSV file, comma separated values file, and I could give it a suitable file name, and then it will be available to me to work on later on. On this occasion, rather than save it, I'm just going to open it, and it will in fact open it in Excel, because my installation of Excel is set up to treat CSV files as Excel spreadsheets. So I'm going to open, and once it's downloaded the data, I should see it all available for me to work on in Excel. Okay, well here we are. Excel has opened. I normally get it in some not quite maximized form, so let me just maximize the window and maximize the sheet within the window. It will quite often be the case when you've downloaded data like this that the date column, the A column, will be too narrow, so let me just make that wide enough to see the date. And the other thing to note about the date is, depending on which country you are working in or set up to be working in, you may or may not have the dates in the same sequence as me. Now the dates that were in the data I downloaded were in the US notation of month, day, year. But Excel is clever enough to know that because I've got them set on UK settings, they say day, month, year. And provided you've got Excel set up properly, it should adjust them to whatever's good for you. So if you're looking at this from a US site and you're looking at these dates and thinking they're the wrong way around, well, that's the way we have them in the UK. And it really, what I'm going to show you from now on, it makes absolutely no difference which format you've got in, as long as it's the right one for you and it makes sense to you. Now we have a couple of other things to do to this data. One of the things we're going to do is to freeze the top row so that we can always see that as we scroll through the data. So go on to View, go on to Freeze Panes, Freeze Top Row. And then I'm going to sort the data. Now if you're familiar with sorting in Excel, if I want to sort it on date, I can click that column, go on to Data. If I just click on AZ, which is sort oldest to newest, A to Z, as you'll know, Excel warns me, do you want to expand the selection to include all of the columns rather than just sorting that column? Of course I do want to expand the selection. And there we are. I have my data and a very large number of records for all the days for all of those years. And I may choose to delete some of this data to make it a bit easier to work with later on. But for the moment, you can see, going right back to the 15th of April and right up to yesterday, I now have my prices available and ready to work on. Now I need to explain a little bit about dividends and splits before we go any further, partly to explain the meaning of adjusted close. If a company pays a dividend on a particular date, then closing prices before that date are reduced by the amount of that dividend, because it's deemed that the value of the particular stock is actually reduced by that amount, because basically that amount of money is being given away by the company. So what happens then is that the adjusted close is changed to account for that dividend payment. Now in fact that has no real effect in terms of how you proceed with graphing and charting. It's important to understand though that it happens because it partly explains the difference between close and adjusted close. In fact, if I go back to Yahoo, there is an option to show dividends only, and if I do that for this particular equity, we can see that they've generally paid a dividend about once every 3 months, and that partly explains the difference between close and adjusted close. Now let's take a look at stock split, because that is also important. Again, I'm looking at the same equity, and back in 1998 this company did a 2-for-1 stock split. What that means is that people who held shares in this company, the number of shares that they held was doubled, which in effect halved the value of each of them. And if you look at the closing price, you'll see that it pretty much halved on between March and April. I've got monthly figures shown here. So if we actually plotted that price, it would appear that they suffered about a 50% drop in price, which was purely because of this stock split. Now what happens here is that the closing price is adjusted to make it appear that the split occurred much earlier in time, and then in fact there was no real split in stock, and the adjustment is made to the earlier closing prices to compensate for what is an apparent 50% drop in value. So the company basically halved the values of the shares, but the closing prices halves that, because of course the overall value of twice as many shares at half the price is pretty much the same. So we're just about ready to start now. I'm going to only plot the last 10 years worth of this data, so I'm going to delete quite a bit of it from the spreadsheet, and then I'm going to check to see if there are any splits in the range that remains. I can do that by going back to Yahoo and just having a quick scan through the prices over the last 10 years from 2001 to 2011. Okay, I've checked over that range of 10 years. There were no stock splits in that range. So now I'm going to do one final thing, which is the other problem with the data we've got at the moment is that the high and low prices are against close. They are not adjusted. And I need to adjust those as well, because it's the adjusted close price that I'm going to use for most of the charting and graphing that I'm going to do. Now the recommended way to adjust these is to adjust each of them in the ratio of adjusted close to close. So for instance, if I insert a column here, put a heading in of adjusted high, the formula I want in here is equals the actual high, which is C2, times, and then it's the ratio of adjusted close, which is H2, to close, which is F2. And that gives me my adjusted high, which obviously I can format, fill down, and then do the same to produce an adjusted low. So there we are. I've now got my adjusted high, adjusted low to go with the adjusted close, and I'm just about ready to start working on these graphs and charts. And we're going to start that in the next section, so I'll see you then.